So last Sunday we began what I'm calling the Lenten Lighthouses, meditation on our Lenten journey to Easter. So we had the first lighthouse, the present moment, the second lighthouse, the wilderness. Now, in regard to today's readings, we have the third Lenten lighthouse called Wonderful, the Wonderful Lighthouse. It seems that when Jesus took Peter, James and John at the top of the mountain, they went up there, top of the mountain, and he was transfigured in their sight. They had a vision of the future, which helped them in the present. So the future, Jesus was transfigured into his ultimate way of being the Lord and giver of life in glory, the death and resurrection of Jesus in a glimpse. And Peter said, it's wonderful. This sort of heavenly experience is wonderful. And we really can see the poetry there because Jesus became luminous. His clothes were described as dazzling white. And Moses and Elijah are there. A glimpse of future glory. Then they went down the mountain, but they were given hope. And this is in the middle of the Transfiguration, and this is in the middle of Mark's Gospel, so they're down the mountain on their way to another mountain called Calvary. The difficulty of truly believing that the Messiah, Jesus, was a suffering Messiah. Now, we too have little wonderful moments in our life, a little taste of heaven, touch of heaven to help us in the present moment. From our theological tradition, the Catechism of the Catholic Church says that heaven is the ultimate end and fulfilment of the deepest human longings, the state of supreme definitive happiness. That's where we're heading towards. Theologically, it's called the beatific vision. The Catechism describes this as the Church calls this contemplation of God in his heavenly glory the beatific vision. This future gives us a little taste that helps us in the present moment, the challenges of life. I think there's three brief little pastoral observations to make about our glimpse of Jesus in the moment of the present, in the midst of our problems. First of all, everybody, our Catholic tradition says you should never take salvation for granted. That's why at a Catholic funeral, the very first thing we want to do is to pray for God's mercy on the person who's died. That's the number one. Well, we might doubt whether our prayers for the living have made a great deal of difference, but we should never doubt that our prayers for those who have died are not heard by God, and we intercede. Even in their death, we pray that God will forgive their sins. That's the number one. We don't take salvation for granted. See, the difficulty at the moment is that around the society, they say, well, when you come to a funeral, it should be simply the celebration of the life of somebody. And they're like canonisation ceremonies. Well, that's a second point, to appreciate the gifts and the charisms of the person who's died, but it's not the main, it's the second point. The third point is that we pray for the person, the relatives and the friends of the person who's died, that God will console them. So we never take salvation for granted. And even in the death, the funerals, we always pray, number one, for God's merciful forgiveness, that the person might rest in peace. Let's keep that in mind. The second point is we should never take the freedom that God's given us for granted. Incredibly, God has given us complete freedom to either reject him or accept him. So that's why we have our teaching on purgatory and hell. It's not a teaching on heaven alone, there's also purgatory and hell. Why? Not because God's keen to send us to hell, But we often send ourselves to hell by the misuse of the God-given freedom. The freedom God's given us is that we can worship in fullness of truth. But when we divert around 180 degrees deliberately, willfully, then we're sending ourselves to hell. So that's the second point. God takes our freedom seriously. And the third and the final point on this is that salvation is inextricably linked with our practical charity to anyone in need. So when we get to heaven, face to face at the end of our earthly pilgrimage, we will be asked, "You did it to me. I came to you in your life. Did you visit me? Did you clothe me? Did you feed me? Did you act with justice?" So these aren't optional extras. They're central. You have a look at the scriptures, they're very insistent on that our salvation is inextricably linked with the way we respond in our earthly life to those who are on the perimeters, those in need. So that's our third Lenten Lighthouse. Wonderful.